All right, let's get ready to go. It's my pleasure to introduce Dana Shum from Raytheon Corporation, and she has been instrumental in setting up what we call our Scaled Agile Framework here within WGISS. And this is part of our WGISS technical exposition, or yeah, I guess it's a technical exploration, exposition, what have you. And I just wanted to point out that, sometimes the technology that we're working with or that we need to deploy is not just in terms of software and hardware. Sometimes it's technology and how we organize ourselves to produce that software and hardware. And so what we're going to look at here is a set of organizational principles and procedures that allow widely distributed teams to still work in an agile fashion and still, get an immense number of things done. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Dana, who's going to be talking about Agile in general, but in specifically the Scaled Agile Framework, which is, again, a way of doing these small Agile projects, but in a much larger context. So Dana?
All right. Thank you, Chris. So yeah, as Chris said, my name is Dana Shum. I've been working with NASA's WGISS group for about 5 years now and doing Agile development for, goodness, maybe longer than I care to admit at this point. I'm just waiting for the slides to show on my screen. And we will get started. But while they're loading, I was kind of kick off. So yeah, we're going to be talking a little bit about Agile development. I'm going to start with just a quick overview of Agile, just to make sure we're all on the same page about what Agile is. In particular, just touch on Scrum, one of the Agile methodologies, and then go into the Scaled Agile Framework, which I will just refer to as SAFE. It's the acronym we tend to use for it, and talk through a little bit about our journey and kind of what prompted us to start using it and some of the key aspects. On the third slide, as we talk about the Agile development overview, so if we think back to the late 1990s, what we were finding in the software industry was that software was hard, and we had a lot of projects using a traditional waterfall methodology where we would do requirements for 6 months to a year, and we would go into a preliminary design phase for another 6 months, and maybe a detailed design phase for 6 months, and we'd code for a year, and then do some testing, and then ultimately, at the tail end of that, years later, we might actually have something to deploy. And then I think the stats were pretty awful. Like 30% of those projects would just fail outright. They would never reach delivery. Other ones were late. They were over budget. And they were often deployed either with bugs or with features that no one cared to use. And so a lot of industry leaders at that time started coming up with new ways of doing software development. And you start to see things come up like Scrum or extreme programming. And a group of people got together in 2001. And if you go to the next slide, the Agile Manifesto, they sat down and they said, what do we think was wrong with the way we were doing software development up until now, and how can we make it better? And what they really started to say was that some things are more important than others when it comes to building software. So in green here, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. They're more important than processes and tools. Working software matters more than perfect documentation. Customer collaboration, that matters more than having the perfect contract. And responding to change is critically more important than following a plan. And so they end by saying the ones on the right matter, they're good, but the ones on the left matter more. And it started to shift how, as an industry, we've been developing software. You can switch to the next slide, because they still have not loaded on my screen for some reason, but we're going to make it work. And so one of the kind of very popular methodologies in Agile is called Scrum. And one of the key things that Scrum brought, and a lot of Agile methodologies followed with, is this idea of iterative development. So instead of the waterfall where you're going to go and do all your requirements, define your requirements first, and then build and do this very stepwise process to the end, Scrum said, let's see if we can do very quick turn cycles and iterative development, and they called them sprints. So a 2-week sprint, inside those 2 weeks, you would do your planning, you would build some code, you would integrate that code with the rest of your system, you would test it all, and then have a product at the end that you could ultimately deploy as working software. So every 2 weeks. And teams have varied on this. Some teams will do 4 weeks, some teams will do 3 weeks. We on our program have kind of stuck with 2 weeks for a while after experimenting a bit. Another key concept from Scrum is to stop doing, once a week status meetings where you sit for an hour and everyone goes around the room, and instead just do quick 15-minute scrums or stand-ups every day with the goal of removing blockers so that developers are encouraged to be vocal with challenges they're running into, and the more managerial roles on the team are encouraged to take those concerns to heart and go solve them immediately and get people unblocked and get people moving as fast as possible. And the other key aspect of Scrum, and this is true of Agile too, is that teams are very strongly encouraged to evaluate what they're doing every sprint or every 2 weeks. And this is not only the product that they're building, really getting good feedback on that from end users or customers or their own team, but also evaluating the process that they're using. Is it working? Are we inefficient? Are there things we could do better? Do we need new tooling? Do we have a single point of failure? To continually ask themselves those questions and encourage the entire team to do better. That's called retrospectives in Scrum methodology. Next slide, please, Josh. Another key concept from Scrum and Agile is to shift a little bit of the thinking regarding requirements. So as we're all probably remember from waterfall days and even just traditional systems engineering, we tend to think of requirements as the system shall do something. And sometimes those were self-explanatory, and sometimes they weren't. And sometimes you could pick up a requirement and know how to implement it, and other times it left you with 15 questions regarding what this requirement meant. So Agile started to shift how they approached this and invented something called a user story. And what it allowed us to do is not only to further define what is needed, but also to provide context for how a user would ultimately use our system. And it's formulaic and says, as a user, I want to do something, fill in the blanks, so that I can accomplish a goal. So I picked an easy example. As a scientist, I want to search by the name of a lake so that I can quickly find only the data relevant to my search. So immediately, a developer, when they pick that up, not only knows that they have to be able to search by the name of the lake, but they also know the user that this is targeted to, which helps them understand where to build the feature into the tool, and they understand the end result that the user is trying to get. So it allows developers to really understand the system from a user's perspective. And what we have learned is that when we can provide that to our developers, they build a better system. They are much more likely to make the right decisions on their own instead of having to have continual checkpoints with external people to say, did you mean X or did you mean Y? They're far more successful this way. And Scrum also acknowledged that software estimation is very hard. That was obviously one of the problems we had in Waterfall was it's hard to estimate software. And so Scrum encourages teams to stop estimating in hours because hours are pretty much always wrong. We don't really, just as humans, we don't allow for enough wiggle room in our hours. And so they actually recommended something they called story points, which is really just a Fibonacci series of numbers. So you have 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and some teams will go up to 21 or bigger. And if you have a user story that is estimated as 1 story point, that's your simplest story ever. It might be change the color of a button to green, something very simple. A 2-point story is something that is twice as complex. 3-point, obviously 3 times as complex. But as you start increasing those Fibonacci numbers, you'll notice there's more gaps between those numbers, which means the bigger anything gets, there's more risk involved, there's more uncertainty involved, and we acknowledge right up front that we don't really know what, how long this thing is going to take. And so again, that helps just in honest estimation. It also has proven to be very helpful for teams to figure out what they call their velocity, or how many story points can you accomplish in a sprint. And that has, again, proven to help teams hit delivery dates with far more accuracy than we had seen in traditional waterfall estimation. The next slide, Josh, please. So the other kind of big change that we see in Scrum is a shift in how teams are organized. And you'll see this continue also when we talk about SAFe, is that in a more traditional engineering organization or waterfall development organization, you would see a team of systems engineers, and you would see a team of developers, and you would see a team of testers. And those individual teams would often be handing things over the wall to each other. So systems engineers might build up requirements and hand them over the wall to the developers, who would build and build and build and then hand everything over the wall to the testers. Scrum has encouraged what they call cross-functional teams. And this, their teaming approach is in 2 ways. One, they talk about an ideal team size. And this was very research-based into what makes for highly productive teams. And they say 7 plus or minus 2 people is the right team size to be effective and efficient. And we've seen that on our end too. We actually oftentimes end up lower than this and then feel the pain from having teams that are too small and then are trying to encourage ourselves to get back to the 7 plus or minus 2 teams. Because if we think about it, there's overhead in any team. And so if a team is too small, you're paying too much in overhead compared to the work that's getting done. If a team is too big, it's just hard for communication to happen quickly and effectively. So that 7 plus or minus 2, based on our experience, has really proven to be true. And again, this idea of the roles on a team being very blended and not all developers. So Scrum introduced 2 kind of new roles. One they call a product owner, and this person is really there to represent the end user or the customer, so that when developers have questions, they have someone to ask. And there's a role called a Scrum Master, whose job is really to focus on process, efficiencies. Where is the team struggling? Where are they blocked? What is slowing them down? And then this person's job is to fix it, so that the team can do so the developers can do what they do best, which is build working code. And then obviously there's developers who write code. There are testers in the same team. Sometimes they're one and the same as the developers who are testing the code. We'll often include what we call a DevOps engineer. And this person is ensuring that code can get deployed easily and that it stays operational. They're responding to operational outages and working tightly with the developers to fix any operational problems. And then systems engineers and architects are also often included directly in the team. Sometimes they're actually just acting as the product owners because they understand what needs to be built. And sometimes they are just a straight systems engineering role in the team. So we've been executing kind of this way for a good while now, even before we had switched to SAFe, just when we were straight Agile teams. And so really for decades, for a lot of us, well, I guess over 1 decade, I should say, we've been doing Agile, and especially on our program with NASA ESDIS, we've been doing it pretty well. And we started getting to a point where we had lots of individual teams, 7 plus or minus 2 people, who were very good at Agile, and we could build products individually pretty well. And then our products started to reach a level of maturity where we really wanted to integrate different products together to build more complex things. And Josh, if you can switch to the next slide, please. It got hard for teams to communicate, and it was hard for a team to know when another team could deliver something to them, when they would be able to integrate with the change they needed, and we started having some real problems doing that. And then about that time, we started hearing about something called the Scaled Agile Framework, or SAFe, and it sounded pretty interesting. And sure enough, we've tried it now for over 2 years, and we have about 150 people kind of executing now in this methodology. And so far, it's been going pretty well. So I want to kind of dig into, what SAFe is and what it promises. So Josh, if you could actually advance forward 2 slides to the one that says the claims. And so what SAFe claimed from their websites, and you can go and read their case studies there, was that when organizations started using SAFe, they were up to 50% happier, more motivated employees. And they claimed faster development, reduced defect, increased productivity. And so, of course, that all sounded really good to us. And so we sent a couple of us off to a class to learn what this was and to see if we thought it would be a good fit for our organization. And so we can go to the next slide, Josh. And so this slide has a big picture on it, and it's literally called the SAFe Big Picture. And at first, it's incredibly overwhelming. And so in the next couple of slides, we will dig through what this looks like and what the different layers mean in some of the high levels. But if you were to go to that link on the bottom, which is just scaledagileFramework.com, you can click on any part of this, and it will pop up informational pages that describe everything in detail. So if you want to learn more about it, that is absolutely the best starting point, is just to go and click around and learn. But at the basics, what SAFe did was they took everything that was working about Agile, and really Scrum, you'll see, is what they modeled most everything on, and they scaled it up. And they said, how do we make this work at an enterprise level or across multiple teams while not losing some of those core beliefs, if you remember from the Agile Manifesto? They wanted to carry those beliefs and thinking through and say, how do we shape an organization and an entire kind of engineering world to work this way? The next page, please, Josh. And so this next page is called the Lean Agile Mindset, and this is straight from SAFe. And it really just talks about how they approached building the SAFe framework and kind of the principles that you need to understand to apply SAFe correctly. And so at the top there in the green, you'll see, the goal is value. And really what they're after is that core tenet from the Agile Manifesto of we value working software over pretty much everything else. Like, that is what builds value in our organization, is getting software working and deployed. Everything else is kind of subservient, if you will, to that ultimate goal. And then at the bottom, in the foundation, they recognize that the only way to change an organization is to change the way we're leading. And so they have this concept of lean, agile leadership. And what it encourages is, it says all leaders in an organization should really be trained in SAFe so that they understand how to lead in a quote-unquote lean way. And when you hear lean in all of these terminologies, it's really referencing back to lean engineering as we learned it from the manufacturing industries, from Six Sigma, from critical chain, from theory of constraints. All of that is built into Agile software development. They kind of pulled from what different industries were doing and said, how do we take this thinking and apply it to software? And again, they say you have to train your leaders so that they are helping people make better decisions. And then they kind of have these four tenets. One is obviously respect for people and culture. The only way you get working software is by having a healthy team to build it. And so that has to be kind of core in what you do. And then they talk about flow. The manufacturing world understood this, I think, long before the software world did, in terms of how do you optimize flow on a manufacturing floor when you're making cars. That industry figured it out, and software has now started to come around and said, we need to optimize flow in our development organizations too. We need to build in quality and make sure that we are, again, delivering software on a regular cadence and with repeatable quality. And then SAFe adds in innovation. This was unique to SAFe in a way that I don't think Agile really kind of promoted it as much. But they strongly say that if you are going to deliver value, you have to allow time for developers and for teams to innovate, to provide space for them to be creative and to change directions and find new and better ways of doing things. And to do so, you have to kind of get out of their way. So again, as a manager, as a leader, how do we get out of their way and free them up to do great things? And then finally, again, hearkening back to Agile, relentless improvement, and continually reevaluating what you're doing, how you're doing it, looking at your data, and then making better decisions and fixing it. And so that's kind of at the core of what kind of SAFe is, and all of their practices and the different aspects of their framework really come back to that. So if you are a leader in an organization, or even just a team lead, doesn't have to be high up, and you are thinking about SAFe, that's something, the Lean Agile mindset is something that you'd want to spend some time learning about. And it's something that on our side we definitely talk about and hold each other accountable to also, right? As we as team leads are making decisions about, well, should we do this or should we do this? We're going, okay, how will that hurt our flow? Or, oh gosh, like we promised the teams this time for innovation and we're about to trample on it. And we try to hold each other accountable to that. Next slide, please, Josh. And so there's four aspects of SAFe that I want to dig, three that I want to dig into a little bit. So the roles, and the first couple will sound familiar, kind of how work flows, and then also the program increment planning. The next slide, please. But my slides still haven't loaded on my side. So, Josh, I'm going to assume that you are on the levels of SAFe slide.
Yes, I am. We're good.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to start at the bottom on this slide. So again, this is back to the SAFe big picture that is very overwhelming to stare at. And what you'll notice is that there are different levels broken in here. The bottom one is what we just call the team level, and it's the Agile team. So if you are an Agile team today, again, 7 plus or minus 2 people, this is effectively where you're at. You're doing fine. You're probably operating in a certain cadence or 2-week sprints. You're building, you're testing, you're deploying. You probably have a Scrum Master and a product owner. And then they add on a next level, and they say, okay, well, what does this look like when we scale up and have a handful of teams? And when you start approaching, 50 people to 150 people, how does that look? And so they add in a level they call a program, and they add in a horizontal bar. You'll see it looks like a gold train, like a speeding train, and that is intentional. That is something that they call the Agile Release Train, or ART. And what it is it's meant to be a kind of long-lived virtual organization. And so it's comprised of multiple Agile teams. And the reason that they use the metaphor of a train is that trains tend to depart a station and arrive at the next station on a very reliable schedule. So they have this fixed cadence, and they have a fixed speed at which they operate so that you can plan around a train. The second thing is that trains tend to pick up cargo and deliver it somewhere else. And so in the software world, how they're using the train analogy is to say that an agile train, or again, this group of multiple teams, will be working on a set cadence, moving at a set speed so that we can reliably deliver software. And we will pick up our own cargo, which might mean prototypes, it might mean software, it might mean documentation, and we will work on it for a period of time, and we'll then deliver it at the next station when we land. And so that analogy kind of helps us to understand how they want these teams to work together. And then at the higher level, above that, you'll see kind of cross-train coordination, which is they call the portfolio level. We've only just started getting here. So for about, I guess, a year and a half, we were running with one Agile release train, which had about 100 people on it. And in the beginning of 2018, so about 7 months ago, we split and now have 3 Agile release trains running. And so just now are we starting to work through this cross-train coordination. And how do we ensure that if we need to build something that crosses 3 different trains, and each one of those trains might cross, 8 different teams, how do we coordinate that work, and what does that look like? And so that's been pretty new for us, but still pretty critical. Next page, please. So one of the things that is critical to making all those levels happen is having the right rules at each level. And so at that team level, the very bottom, these are the same rules in SAFe that you have in Agile today, right? You have a Scrum Master, you have a product owner, and you have that cross-functional development team working together. So really nothing new there in terms of the rules. But the one thing that SAFe did throw out into this mix of how do you organize a team is on the next slide, Josh, is as it relates to the team structure. And so they said not only should teams be cross-functional, but you should also feel free to reorganize them as needed so that you can reduce dependencies and handoffs. So if we think about that, if you had a new feature you were trying to build and it crossed between 2 different teams, let's pretend right now we have a UI or user interface team and a back-end kind of database team, and you needed to build a feature for the impact of both of those teams. Instead of having each of those teams having to talk to each other kind of periodically throughout the PI and then only maybe integrate at the end of the PI, SAFe would propose that you pull 2 members from one team and 2 members from the other team, making up numbers, but pull several people from each team, separate them, and say, all right, newly formed team, you have one job in life, and it's to make this feature complete end to end. because, again, you're trying to reduce those dependencies, reduce the handoffs, and it forced that newly formed, what they will call a feature team, to talk to each other directly, integrate continuously with each other, and ultimately then build this feature faster and with fewer defects, purely because you've fixed a lot of the human communication problems involved in having multiple teams. So again, that is something that SAFE brought to us, and we make use of off and on. It's something that we also want to make more use of, because when we have tried these feature teams and spun them up for 3 to 6 months, they have been very, very effective at accomplishing whatever job we give them. And then once that feature is done, they go back to their original home teams, and life moves on, and they pick up the next round of work. But it is critical, if you decide to form feature teams, that their daily scrums are with their feature team, that they are in one chat room together. If you are in an office area, move their seats. Let them sit beside each other. Make them a true team, even if it's only for 3 to 6 months. That has proven, time and time again to be helpful for us, and something that we were very thankful to learn from SAFE. Next page, please, Josh. And so that was at the team level, and now if we scale up to the train level, you'll see some very similar concepts here. So SAFE adds in, obviously, some new lingo, as most frameworks do. For release train engineer, which is really the Scrum Master at the higher level, a product manager, equivalent of a product owner at this level, and a system architect who's trying to build, how are all these teams going to work together to build this system. And then business owners come into play, which are really kind of the customer or the government stakeholders in our case, to say, this is what I want to build, this is where I want to go, and how do we then use the trains and the teams to make that happen. Next page, Josh. And at the portfolio level, they scale this even higher. I'm not going to go into this in much detail. If you want more information on that, I would highly recommend go to the website and click on them. We, again, are just starting kind of into this path of what does it look like to have epic owners, which kind of take work and give it to multiple trains, which then give it to multiple teams. So we're just starting down that path. Next page, so we're going to switch a little bit into flow of work. And then on the next page, on defining the work, how this is envisioned to work, overuse of the word, is that at a high level, your customer, your end user, business owner, whoever's kind of in charge in your organization, has some initiatives or goals that they want to achieve. And those then need to be broken down into what SAFE will call epics. And those epics are a bit more tangible, but still really big. If you were to think of sizing of these, an epic still might be something that's going to take a year-ish to accomplish. But it's tangible. It's a step towards these goals that ultimately want to be achieved. And then on step 3, at the train level, the train's product manager is taking those epics and breaking them down even further into features. And then the features get broken down into the teams so that the teams can then build out the code. So this is very similar to traditional requirements decomposition. It's just done in a slightly different way, again with the goal of providing more context to the developers who ultimately inherit this feature so that they understand how it fits and how it aligns to this larger initiative. Next page. And so as the work gets broken down in terms of content between epics and features and then down into ultimately user stories at the teams, there's also an angle of scheduling it. In Agile and in SAFE in particular, we don't tend to talk much about a quote-unquote schedule. we actually tend to use the word roadmap far more often, which is a little bit looser. And what it really is allowing us to do is to say, this is the work, like let's pretend we have 5 features, and we'll say these first 3 features we know are the most important ones, and we're going to put those on our roadmap in these next 3 months. And then feature 4 and feature 5 are a little less important, so I'm going to put 1 out 3 months, and I'm going to bucket 1 out maybe 6 months, so that they're scheduled out there, but with some wiggle room as you hit those out months for the new stuff that we know is going to change. And so what you'll see is that that gets done at a bunch of different levels. So not only does the train have a roadmap saying, here's what I think is critical in the next 3 months, and here's a rough notion of where I'm going in the next 6 to 9 months, but down at the team level, each team is also doing the same thing. And so that allows us all to check alignment kind of up and down the train to say, or up and down the organization, to say, are we all working on the same, do we all view the same things as critical at the same time? And do we believe that these will ultimately finish by whatever deadlines that we have? Because at the end of the day, missions launch at a certain date, and those things have to happen. And so the road mapping, along with this decomposition of work, allows us to project when we think we'll actually be able to hit those deadlines. Next slide. And then obviously once you have the work decomposed and kind of laid out on a schedule or a roadmap, you then also need to status this. And what we have been really focusing on recently is how do we automate statusing as much as possible so that it's all driven from what the developers are actually doing. So as developers close user stories, how do we work so that that rolls up into a % complete on an epic, which I can then report out to any customer who cares about it to say this is where we're at, and based on the rate we've been working to date, our estimated delivery date is now I'm going to make up November 3rd. In a lot of tooling, we use Jira on our side, which is an Atlassian product. They make that a lot simpler than it was in the past. But it is important kind of at each level that the teams keep their tooling up to date with their current progress, and likewise the trains, so that ultimately that can flow back up to the higher levels. Next slide. And so kind of final topic, but certainly not least, because it is a little bit of the magic of SAFe, is what we call program increment planning, or PI planning. On the next slide, one of probably the most crucial thing that our organization got from SAFe was aligning into one cadence. So before SAFe, if you remember, in our group we had a lot of different Agile teams. Some were doing 5-week sprints. Some were doing 2-week sprints. Some people's 2-week sprints started at the same time and some didn't. So if you are a team who's on a 2-week sprint and you realize you need something from another team, and that other team is in the middle of their 5-week sprint, they might tell you, I'm sorry, come back 3 weeks from now when we're going to plan our next sprint, and then we'll hear your concern. And so we had delays all throughout that process of trying to get one team to deliver something to another team. What SAFe says is put everybody on the same cadence. Have their sprints all start on the same date, end on the same date, and plan them together. So for us, we do what we call a 12-week program increment, or PI, and that is broken down into 5 sprints, 5 2-week sprints, plus a 2-week IP, which is called innovation and planning. That innovation and planning, if you remember, was one of those core lean values from SAFe, and that they want teams to have room and time in their day to innovate. And so they allowed this 2-week period at the end of every PI for innovation and also for planning of the next sprint. So again, we all start on the same time at the beginning of 12 weeks. We get together and we have a planning session, and then we have 5 sprints each 2 weeks plus a 2-week IP. And some people's concerns about SAFe was, well, gosh, like, does that mean you can only deploy every 12 weeks? No. You can deploy whenever you want to deploy. You can send out a release whenever it makes sense. Because, again, when you're doing Agile correctly, you should always end every 2 weeks with working software, which could be deployed if needed. Next slide, please, Josh. So at the beginning of every 12-week IP, or 12-week PI, we have a full 2-day planning session. And there's a picture there of all of us together. We get in a very big room. Now we're in 2 very big rooms since we have multiple trains. And throughout the day, throughout those 2 days, the teams spend some time demoing their recent accomplishments. We do a retrospective of the past 12 weeks to see what we could do better. And then we delve into where are we going next. And ultimately, the teams break out and go off and plan those 2 weeks at a very low level. Next page, Josh. So actually, the next 2 pages you'll see are just an example agenda of what those 2 days look like. When we first started and thought about flying all of our kind of semi-distributed teams here, 4 times a year for a 2-day session, it was a little overwhelming at first. I'm not going to lie, both in terms of cost and expectations, and were we really going to get enough value out of these 2 days to make it worth the cost? The answer from my perspective is overwhelmingly yes. Like, we have gotten far more value out of those 2 days than the cost that we put into it. But what those 2 days look like, the first morning, again, retrospective, some talks from the leadership, either train leads or business leaders or customers, to help developers understand where we're going, what we're trying to do, how the work they do is ultimately being used in the world. That's the intent of the morning sessions, is to kind of orient them. And then after lunch, the teams actually go and break out for 3 hours, and you'll see them all around the room with a bunch of white paper and stickies up on the wall, or Post-it notes up on the wall, saying, all right, what can we do in Sprint 1? What can we do in Sprint 2 to accomplish the features that have been laid out for them as their goals? At the end of day 1, we actually kick all of the development teams out of the room, and the managers stay back and look around the room to say, are we going to get there? Are we going to hit the deadlines we need to hit based on what the teams are showing us they can do? Or do we need to make some adjustments? Sometimes those adjustments are minor tweaks, like, hey, I know I asked you to do 3 things, but I see you can't get to them all. Just drop that 3rd one, and can you please make sure you get number 1 and number 2 100% done? That's an easy tweak. Sometimes we have shut down entire development teams and reallocated those people to other teams because we needed more progress on teams. And SAFe allows you this flexibility to do that. Next slide, please, Josh. Day 2, if there were any adjustments, the team comes back and makes those and redoes any planning. And then we'll actually talk through risks, and I'll show you that in a second, and do a confidence vote at the end to say, we've sat here for a day and a half, heard where we're trying to go, we've detailed out our user stories, we've listed all of our risks. Do we believe this is accomplishable? Do we believe we have a good plan? And everybody votes. And if the vote doesn't pass, we go around and we say, okay, what's your concern? What should we change? Because ultimately, we want everyone in that room to feel confident that we can accomplish the plan we laid out. And then we do a quick retrospective just of the 2-day session, so we can figure out how to do that better next time, too. Next slide, Josh. So coming out of PI planning, there's actually 4 things we're going after. 1 is objectives. The 2nd are dependencies. The 3rd is risks. And the last one is that commitment that we just talked about. And so I'll talk real quick about objectives and risks on the next slide. So if you can go to the next PI objectives slide, Josh. So if you remember in that work flow down chart, we have features coming kind of from the trains down to the teams. And the teams then take those features and say, okay, how can I accomplish this? What user stories do I need? How big are those user stories? Where can I fit? Do I have the right resources? And they plan that all out. And then at the end of those 2 days, they echo back what we call an objective, which is the team's version summarizing what they can accomplish and how they think it achieves that goal that they were given. And so that is a critical step to make sure that the teams really understand what they're building and that they're building the thing that was asked of them and there wasn't any disconnect in communication. Next page is the dependencies chart. So this is a real picture from one of our early PI sessions. And we manage team-level dependencies to this day on a wall with tape and Post-it notes. And what that board is actually showing is let's pretend in Sprint 1, Team A needs something from Team B. And so both Team A and Team B will put a note up on that board and say, you know, in Sprint 1, we're committing to this dependency. It's on the board during PI planning, and then afterwards we digitize it a little bit, either putting on a wiki or we're moving to some other tools for it also. This has been critical for us in SAFE because we did not have a good way to do this prior to SAFE. And again, it was one of those things we struggled with was how do you get teams to talk about their dependencies, understand what another team needs from them, and then plan it and commit to those dates and hold them accountable to those dates. So that has been one of the biggest wins coming out of SAFE from our perspective. And then on the next slide, Josh, is risks. Risks are another thing that every organization talks about, and I think SAFE does a better job than other methodologies I've seen about involving developers and low-level contributors into this conversation. And so as teams are planning, every single person is encouraged to grab a pink Post-it note and write the risk on there. You know, if this other organization that I need something from doesn't deliver by, you know, the middle of June, then I can't complete my objective. Okay, now as managers, we can take that and we can work that and help reduce that risk. But maybe we wouldn't have known about it if the team hadn't said it. So the teams write them up, and then at the end of day 2, as a group, we read every single one of those, you know, in a room full of close to 100 people, and decide what we're going to do about it. Do we accept it? Is there something we can do to mitigate it? And if so, who's going to own it and work it? And again, that and dependencies have both, I think, really helped us in the SAFE methodology. And then last, just a quick note, you know, we've been at this now for over 2 years, and so far so good. We've changed a lot over those 2 years and continue to change. There are pieces of SAFE that at first we thought we didn't need, and now we realize that they were a really good idea and we should have used them. Other things we've tried and said, meh, that feels overly process heavy for us, and we dropped it. It's a framework, just like everything else. So it's very adaptable to what you need, but it has really helped us to understand what NASA is trying to do so that we can align our developers to meet those needs. Our communication between our teams and with NASA is a lot better than it was previously. And we've reduced a lot of status meetings. Like, yes, we have a full 2-day planning session, but it's actually cut back on a lot of weekly, hour-long sessions that we used to have to try and keep people aligned. And again, focused us on what's most important and allows us to drop what's not, and continues to reinforce in us this idea of monitoring what we're doing, finding the real problems, and fixing our process as we move forward. And with that, we're going to open it up to questions.
And Dana, we already have one question from Chris Linus. Dana, can you please talk about or speculate on how applicable SAFe is to projects that are not cutting code, like developing standards or architectures?
Yeah, so SAFe has been used really in wide ways. I'm trying to think if I've read any case studies from that angle. I mean, it's used to build cars even, so I can't imagine that there's things that it wouldn't apply to, because it's really, again, about making sure the right people are talking to the right people, learning early and doing small cycles together and being very collaborative, and just not waiting to the end. So if you're going to build a framework together, certainly this concept of sitting down first and talking to each other about it and understanding what you're trying to do and planning out a couple months and committing to each other about deadlines that you're going to hit, that's all applicable whether you're building code or whether you're building, writing a framework document, and then getting back together and reassessing, did that work, did that not work, and refining. So a lot of those tenets of Agile and of Lean, I think, apply no matter what you're doing.
Great, thank you, Dana. Another question, what is the difference between, say, a systems requirement and a user story?
Yeah, it's a lot about context. So when we have a systems requirement, we'll start with the system shall. And so sometimes they leave, and again, a lot of this just depends on the systems engineer writing the requirement, we should say. But I've had a lot of requirements come my way over the years, which I didn't know what to do with. They might say the system shall allow search by field X. Okay, but I don't know who's trying to do that search or where they would be doing that search from or how that fits in. And so then we started writing additional documents to try and fill that gap, when at the end of the day, if we write it in a user story format and say, as this user, okay, I know what screen that user uses. Okay, as this user, I want to search by field X so that I can fill in the blank. That immediately tells me as a developer kind of where this code goes in the bigger picture. Where does it need to live on a UI or in a workflow so that it achieves its goal? And user stories also have something, I didn't talk about it, called acceptance criteria, which are kind of like an old test criteria of what has to be accomplished, what are the success cases and failure cases for this user story. And when it's all written together and kind of bundled up, it's far more clear and concise for a developer to pick up.
Thank you. Another question, do you do any documentation?
We do. We still don't like it because we're still developers, but we do. We just try and limit it. We obviously do user-facing documentation, like users guides or API documentation for some of our systems. What we don't do as much of is very detailed design documents. We'll do enough of design documents to kind of flush out an idea, and then that's it. We certainly are not doing kind of the traditional down to writing pseudocode in a 500-page design document anymore, because we can build the code and try it out faster than we could write that design document anyway. So we really focus on user-facing and very high-level design docs.
Great, thank you, Dana. Are there any other questions? And by the way, if you look at the lower right side of your screen, you'll see the presentation files that you can download. Just click on those, and that'll start a download process. You can get the slides from this presentation. Another question, who then writes a user story so it is more descriptive, as your example showed?
So normally we have the product owners write those, and so the product owner's job is to kind of be the voice of an end user. So when everything's going well, they are the ones who are talking to the customer or to an end user to really understand what needs to be built, and they then will write the user stories for the developers. That's a kind of traditional answer. There are plenty of times when we have developers who have been around for a decade, and they'll write the user stories themselves because they also are talking to end users directly and understanding it. But the textbook answer is the product owner. And that's why a lot of times you'll see a product owner with a systems engineering background.
Thank you, Dana. Another question, who will divide whole the development into each train? Epic owner, does the Epic owner do this?
In terms of the work, yeah, so the Epic owner, again, most of the people in these roles are engineers in some way. The Epic owner will usually divide the work between the trains, knowing kind of what each train is capable of and what a clean interface point would be between that work. Because anytime you divide work, you then also have to integrate it back up to build the full feature. So it is a little bit of kind of a decomposition job there at the Epic owner level.
Thank you, Dana. Are there any other questions? Just type them right into the Q&A pod. It works just like a chat. We do have another question. You mentioned that working software is a main goal. How can this be?
Well, it's really the only thing that seems to matter in our world. So if I spend, I'm going to make up extreme examples. If I spend 2 months writing a design document, that doesn't actually make a satellite fly. But working software or hardware, being put together for a satellite, those are real tangible things that actually make something happen. And so what Agile focuses on is that everything else we do should be subservient to actually having working software, or if you're building a car, it should be subservient to building the car or building the framework, because that's what ultimately gets something done. Obviously, I'm a developer by background, so maybe I'm a little biased, but that's also what Agile has taught us for years.
And Dana, follow-up to that, but what if the working software is not useful yet?
Yeah, fair. And you will see that happen in that either something will get delivered piecemeal, or it's kind of before its time. And so the piecemeal answer worries me less, because if you have a portion of software, it may not be fully useful yet, but that doesn't mean that someone couldn't be testing it or trying it out and learning from it and refining it, so that the ultimate product that it ends up in is even better. In a dream world, and you'll see this always seems easier in the commercial space, you can build things in a way that almost every little piece is useful, right? So if you are going to build just a very simple website and you started off saying, I'm going to get everything stood up and just get this one button on there. Well, that one button might not accomplish much, but it is working software and it is testable, and you can try it out and learn from it, and then you can add on your second button and your third button. And so it's useful even if it doesn't accomplish all of your goals.
Great, thank you, Dana. Are there any other questions? Yes, there is. Is working software in some way a measure that working is being done?
Is it a measure that work is being done? Yeah. And it's, I mean, yes, right? So if a team is able to actually deliver working software, it's indicative that their process is effective, that they have the right people to get the job done, and that they know what they're building. Now, the question of is it working well enough is a good question too, right? Does it actually meet the user's needs or not? But the sooner we can get something out there that you can click on or try, then that's the faster that we can learn, is it right? Did it actually meet the needs of the users?
Thank you, Dana. Are there any other questions? And we do have another question. How does Agile development deal with scope creep?
It shows it up front. So scope creep is a real thing, and it happens in Agile just as much, I mean, if not more than it happened elsewhere. And Agile accepts it in some ways, but in an honest way. So what Agile will do is it'll allow us, so we'll take a sprint for an example. If we have 2 weeks and we go into those 2 weeks and we say we have 10 user stories we're going to work. And on day 2 of the sprint, a customer comes to us and says, well, I also now want you to do this other thing. We can bring it into the sprint, and we have options then. We could have a conversation with our customer right then and say, you brought in this new story, we now need to drop something or else we can't get everything done, and we could drop something right out. And so then scope creep happened, but scope change really didn't, because we dropped something out, and the customer now knows, because you asked for this new thing, we can't give you the thing we had to drop out. Or sometimes, and we do this more often, is we will let the new story come in, and we will try to get everything done and see if we can. And at the end of the sprint, if it's not done, we have metrics to show kind of what got added throughout the sprint, and that's the amount of work that got added, in theory, should at least correlate to the amount of work that did not get done, so that it's very clear and transparent to everyone involved what's going on.
Thank you, Dana. Another question. Does Agile have some measure of developer productivity? In other words, is said developer working up to his or her potential?
Yes and no. It specifically, how do I want to phrase this? Agile will encourage you not to try and use Agile metrics against an individual developer. And there's a couple reasons for it. One is that, let's pretend we have a developer and they are not closing as many tickets or story points as their other developers. If you just look at the metrics, that could look like they're not being as productive as other developers. But what might actually be happening is they might be helping every other developer on their team to get their work done. And so they're really acting in a huge capacity on the team, but their metrics don't show it. And so Agile very much cautions you against using those metrics. What turns out to be the best indicator we've had is really talking to the teammates. Teammates on an Agile team know who is underperforming, because every day they have to all come to a Scrum and say, this is what I was working on yesterday, this is what I got done, this is what I'm doing today. And when a developer shows up at Scrum, 5 days in a row and is still working on the same thing with no indication as to why, teammates understand that that person is either stuck or not working up to their potential. And so feedback from their teammates tends to be the best way to figure this out. Metrics are a little harder to use.
Great. Thank you very much, Dana. Any other questions? And if there are no other questions, I'm going to turn it back over to Chris Linus for some final thoughts.
Thanks, Dana. I really appreciate this. This has been a fantastic session. And in fact, even though I've been on that same SAFe journey with you guys over the last 2 years, I think I still learned, 8 or 9 new things today about how SAFe works. So again, I'd really like to thank you for giving us this talk, and a reminder to everybody, and I'll be sending this out to the WGISS group as well, that the recording of this talk will be posted on the WGISS site for those of our community that weren't able to make it due to time zones and what have you. So thank you again, Dana, and thank you everyone for listening and providing us with a really stimulating discussion period. Bye-bye.
Thank you.